Imagine waking up tomorrow in a world where Homo sapiens aren't the only humans on Earth. You walk through a city. Cars fill the streets. Children are going to school. People are rushing to work. And standing beside you is a Neanderthal. Not a caveman. Not a museum skeleton. A living member of another human species. Maybe Neanderthals have their own communities, their own cultures, their own languages, their own history stretching alongside ours for thousands of years. There could be Neanderthal politicians, scientists, artists. Maybe entire regions of the world were shaped by two different kinds of humans living side by side. And that would force us to answer a question humanity has never had to answer before. If another kind of human was still alive today, how would we treat them? Would they have the same rights as us? Would we live together? Would we compete? Or after thousands of years, would the line between them and us disappear completely? Because as strange as this world sounds, something close to it was once possible. There was a time when two kinds of humans shared the same planet. Homo sapiens and Neanderthals. For thousands of years, neither one knew which of them would still be here in the end. But something happened. One branch became the only surviving human species on Earth. The other disappeared as a separate people. Or did they? Because buried inside the DNA of many people alive today is evidence that this story didn't end as cleanly as we think. But to understand how the world could have been so different, we need to go back 43,000 years. To two fires burning in the same landscape. And to one Neanderthal family standing near the edge of a future they would never see. Let's call one of them Ver. 43,000 years ago, somewhere in what is now Europe, Ver is sitting beside a fire. Around him is his family, his mate, his elderly mother, his two children. One of them is sick. For 3 days the child has been burning with a fever. Ver reaches over and checks his son's forehead. It's a simple moment, but it's important. Because Ver isn't the grunting, mindless caveman from old cartoons. The evidence we have suggests Neanderthals were far more complex than that stereotype. Some individuals survived serious injuries and illnesses that would likely have required help and long-term care from others. They lived in social groups. They depended on one another. They cared for individuals who could not simply survive alone. But a few miles away, another fire is burning. Around that fire sits another kind of human. Homo sapiens. Same landscape. Same year. And for thousands of years, these populations shared parts of Eurasia. They competed. They adapted to changing environments. And sometimes they had children together. What happened next would decide which branch became the only surviving human species on Earth. But here's the part that makes this story far stranger. That outcome was never guaranteed from the beginning. And if history had shifted at just the right moment, Ver's people might not have disappeared at all. In our timeline, Neanderthals eventually disappeared as a distinct population. There probably wasn't one single reason. Their populations were relatively small. The climate changed. Homo sapiens expanded. Resources and territory may have become harder to compete over. And over time, some Neanderthal populations mixed with Homo sapiens. Eventually, there were no longer enough separate Neanderthal communities to continue as a distinct branch of humanity. But now rewind the story. Change one thing. Maybe a larger population survives. Maybe geography protects them. Maybe a region remains favorable to them for longer. Maybe they avoid a population collapse at exactly the right moment. We can't know what specific chain of events would have been enough. But the basic idea isn't impossible. Small changes in population, migration, climate, and geography can completely change which groups survive. So imagine that Ver's descendants remain numerous enough to continue. Generation after generation. They don't stay frozen in time. They adapt. They change. Their children have children. And thousands of years later, Neanderthals are still here. But surviving the prehistoric world would only be the beginning. Because eventually the world begins to change. Agriculture appears. Villages grow. Cities rise. And now, for the first time in history, civilization isn't being built by just one surviving kind of human. Two humanities are entering the future together. And that changes everything. Imagine opening a history textbook in this alternate world. Instead of one surviving human story, there are two. Homo sapiens develop across some regions. Neanderthal populations remain concentrated in others. Both populations change over thousands of years. Both adapt to their environments. Both develop cultures that their ancient ancestors would barely recognize. And this is where our usual image of Neanderthals breaks down completely. People often imagine that if they survived, they would still be exactly like the Neanderthals of 40,000 years ago. But that's not how surviving populations work. The Homo sapiens who first met Neanderthals didn't have cities either. They didn't have writing. They didn't have engines, computers, or modern science. We changed because thousands of years passed. And if Neanderthals survived through those same thousands of years, they would change too. Maybe not in exactly the same way. But they wouldn't simply remain trapped in the Stone Age while the rest of the world moved forward. And eventually, the two populations would have to interact on a scale neither one had experienced before. Trade routes would connect them. People would migrate. Territories would expand. Some communities might cooperate. Others might compete. And eventually, a new invention would create a problem prehistoric humans had never needed to solve. Borders. Because once land becomes territory, one question becomes impossible to avoid. Who gets to decide where one humanity ends and the other begins? And history suggests that question would not have a simple answer. This is where the story becomes uncomfortable. Because we don't need to invent an entirely new kind of history to imagine what could happen next. Homo sapiens have repeatedly competed with other Homo sapiens over land, resources, power, identity, and territory. Now imagine adding something humanity has never experienced in the modern world. A second human species. A population that looks visibly different. A population with its own communities. Possibly its own languages, traditions, and political interests. At first, the differences might seem obvious. But civilization has a way of making simple differences complicated. Because Neanderthals wouldn't just be prehistoric hunters anymore. They could be farmers, traders, builders, soldiers, leaders, and eventually the question would change. Are they intelligent enough to survive? They already survived. The real question would be, are we capable of living beside them? Some societies might cooperate. Others might discriminate. There could be trade in one region and conflict in another. There could be laws protecting Neanderthal communities, and laws attempting to control them. And then another complication appears. Because Homo sapiens and Neanderthals were close enough genetically that they produced children together in the real world. So in this alternate timeline, thousands of years of contact could make the boundary between the two populations increasingly complicated. Some people might remain mostly within their own communities. Others might form families across the divide. And eventually, the question of two separate humanities becomes much harder to answer. Because what happens when the people you've spent centuries calling them become part of your own family? And by the time the modern world arrives, that question could become one of the most important questions in human history. Now imagine what the world looks like today. You turn on the news. A Homo sapiens politician is debating a Neanderthal political leader. You open a history book. Half of human history isn't simply the story of us. It's the story of us and them. Except after thousands of years, them may no longer be a simple word. Maybe there are regions where Neanderthal communities remain a major part of the population. Maybe some cities are home to both. Maybe there are cultural traditions that developed independently for thousands of years. Different languages, different histories, different ideas about identity. And suddenly, ordinary parts of life become questions humanity has never had to face. What does citizenship mean when two human species share the same country? How should laws define equality? Would Neanderthals be treated simply as another human population? Or would their biological differences become the center of endless political arguments? And imagine science. For the first time, scientists wouldn't be studying Neanderthals through bones pulled from the ground. They could study a living sister species. Not to decide whether they were intelligent enough. That question would already be answered every day. They would be studying how two branches of humanity developed differently after separating from a common ancestor. But here's what might be even more important. The existence of Neanderthals could completely change how Homo sapiens see themselves. For almost all of recorded history, we have lived with one enormous assumption. We are the only humans left. In this alternate world, nobody grows up believing that. Every child knows that intelligence isn't exclusive to Homo sapiens. That family isn't exclusive to Homo sapiens. That culture isn't exclusive to Homo sapiens. That civilization itself isn't something owned by just one branch of humanity. And perhaps that would force us to become more humble. Or perhaps it would make the divisions between us even worse. We can't know. But one thing seems almost certain. The modern world would be forced to answer a question we have never been able to avoid because we've never had to ask it. If they think, love, suffer, create, and build civilizations beside us, what exactly would make them less human than us? But there is one final possibility. And it's the strangest one. Because what if, after thousands of years, the two humanities didn't remain separate at all? Remember the DNA we mentioned at the beginning? That isn't a footnote. It's the clue to what actually happened. Neanderthals and Homo sapiens didn't remain completely separate. They met. And sometimes they had children together. Over generations their populations mixed. Today many people carry traces of Neanderthal ancestry. So the real story isn't simply, Neanderthals existed. Neanderthals disappeared. The truth is more complicated. Part of their ancestry continued. It became part of later human populations. And that gives us one final way to look at this entire alternate world. Maybe the most realistic version isn't one where Homo sapiens and Neanderthals remain completely separate forever. Maybe after thousands of years of contact, the line between them and us would slowly become harder and harder to see. Different communities, different histories, different appearances, but increasingly connected families, shared populations, shared ancestry, and eventually humanity might have to accept something strange. There was never a completely clean line between us and them, because in the real world that line was crossed, again and again, and parts of Neanderthal ancestry are still here, which means the alternate world we've been imagining isn't entirely imaginary. Not completely. Ver's people didn't survive as a separate civilization. They didn't build a second modern humanity beside ours. But neither did they simply vanish into nothing. They survived in another way. Inside us. And that changes the question completely. Maybe the real what if isn't. What if Neanderthals survived? Maybe it's this. What if we misunderstood what survival actually means? Picture Ver one more time. He's sitting beside the fire. His family is around him. A few miles away, another fire is burning. Homo sapiens. Neither group knows what the future holds. They don't know that their descendants will compete. They don't know that some of them will meet. They don't know that some will have children together. And they definitely don't know that tens of thousands of years later, people will look back and call one of them extinct. But imagine if history had shifted slightly. If Ver's descendants had survived as a separate people. If today you could walk through a modern city and see another kind of human looking back at you. Not ancient. Not primitive. Not extinct. Just different. The world might have contained two surviving humanities. Two histories. Two branches of the human family growing into the future together. And yet, the strangest part is that the distance between that world and ours may not be as large as it seems. Because buried inside many people alive today are traces of the people sitting around Ver's fire. Not in a museum. Not only in ancient bones. But in living human DNA. Neanderthals didn't survive as a separate humanity. But in the smallest possible way. They never completely left the world.